Evening, folks. How many of you have been to one of these before? Oh, good. So only a few people will know what to expect, and I'm good with the rest of you because I've never done one of these. So I don't know what to expect either. But they convinced me to tell a story about struggle. It was something that they actually had really convinced me to do because I was struggling with me telling a story about struggle, because it's one of those, I've had some, but, with the work that I do, I look around the folks that we work with here, and I'm like, yeah, my struggles don't even compare to the struggles of some folks. So I almost felt like I was a fraud to come up here and talk about stories of struggle and survival. And then as we worked through this, there was something that actually became quite clear to me that I think is important by looking around this room, most of us should struggle with. And so I'll get to that and you'll understand what I mean. About 12 years or so ago, I ended up in seminary. Surprised me, like it surprised a lot of people that knew me, but ended up in seminary. And in one of the classes, we read a book called The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Has anybody read that book? Yeah, it was actually somewhat life-changing for me. So for those of you that haven't read the book, let me just give you a little background about it. It's a story that's set right after World War II. And it's about a little black girl who was fostered by a white family after her alcoholic father raped her and burned the house down. Piccola, which is the name of this little girl, she faces again and again and again in this book the feelings of being ugly because of her dark skin and her thoughts of she would be beautiful if she only had blue eyes. So in reading this story, what kept coming up again and again and again was that whiteness was good and blackness was bad. Blonde hair and blue eyes were what was normative, is what people strived to have, what was considered to be beautiful. And in reading this book, what kept coming back to me was that the ugliness of racism, and that thinking that those without blue eyes or those with dark skin were somehow not as beautiful as somebody that might be blonde hair, blue-eyed, and white. So I'm sitting in this class and we're reading this book week after week after week. I was one of the few white students in this class. I was the only woman with blonde hair and blue eyes in this class, and just kept struggling with this book. And as we're reading this and talking about this, I sat there and felt like the entire room is looking at me, going, this is a story about you being, not in a good way, not a good person, that all the racism that this world felt like it was falling on me. And so I finally asked the professor if I could talk to him, because this was becoming very emotionally difficult for me. And being the wonderful man that he is, said, sure. And I think he kind of knew what I was going to talk to him about, because he's a very wise man. And so I schedule an appointment with him. I walk into his office, which was in the basement of the seminary, and he had a couch there, I guess like he was almost a psychiatrist, and in a way he was for me. And the professor is a black man, and again, somebody that I greatly, greatly respect. And so I walk in and I sit down on this couch, which was very low to the ground and just kind of sunk in. I'm thinking, okay, maybe this is indicative of how this conversation's going to go. But he was so kind, so patient, so loving, and how he sat there and looked at me. as I started to tell him about how I was feeling about this book, and that's not me, that's not who I am, it's not how I think. Again and again with the I, this is not, it's all about me. And he looked at me and said words that changed my life. He looked at me and said, Kellie, it's not personal. Because see, what we were talking about with this book is about white privilege. And I took it to mean that it was on me. It was personal. And I was responsible for all of the issues that were out there. And that particular conversation, that class and that conversation started my struggle with understanding and coming to terms with white privilege. Now, you say that word and a whole lot of people have a whole lot of different reactions, from, yeah, it's real, it exists, it's there, to, I don't know what you're talking about, there's no such thing. And so just struggling with that whole battle about what is it? And it's one of those, okay, well, I personally didn't cause, and I can't personally fix white privilege. Thinking, am I still responsible to do something, to do what I can to bring attention to it? I don't know. And so my struggle with that topic has been for the last 12 years. And I started to think about the norming of whiteness and the othering of blackness. Those of us that are my age or close to my age, mid-50s, give or take 10 years, will remember Band-Aids that were called flesh color Band-Aids. Well, guess whose flesh the color was? Mine. And I'm thinking, well, isn't that interesting? Because that might just be a few people's flesh, but it's certainly not everybody's flesh color. There was also a crayon in the crown box that was also flesh, and it was peach colored. And so as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking those two things just speak to how whiteness was considered the norm, and what people should achieve to be. And it's not like you can change your skin color. And so that kind of continued my thinking on the systemic nature of white privilege and racism. And it was just one of those weird little, I never thought about that before, but I think it speaks volumes to the culture. You know, one of the things that I know that I will never have to worry about, my two sons will never worry about, is getting a DWB. Anybody in here know what a DWB is? Driving while black. Yep. I don't have to worry about that. My sons don't have to worry about that. I don't have to worry about when my sons leave my house that they may get shot. I don't have to worry about when my sons get pulled over by the police, which they both have been for speeding and a few other things. I don't worry about them being shot just because they were pulled over by the police. White privilege. So all of these examples just kept coming up in my life again and again and again. And it's like, you know what? I don't care what people say. They can deny this exists all they want. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means I don't want to pay attention to it because, like me, I might be personally responsible to fix it if it exists. And then I realized something a little bit later that, and this has been a little more, I'd say over the past 4 years or so, that what my professor said to me in Kellie, it's not personal, I actually want to sit down with him. I talk to him often. I want to sit down with him and have a conversation with him and tell him I now disagree with him. It is personal. It is personal, that even though I didn't cause it, it's personal because I need to learn about it. I have a responsibility as a white individual to learn about white privilege. I have a responsibility to act on it, to educate others on it, to speak to it, because being silent is complicity in the system. And it allows white privilege and systemic racism to continue. Racism is not an issue for people of color. It is an issue for all of us. And this has been my struggle over the past 12 years of getting to the point where I am right now with this needs to continue to be my struggle, is speaking to this issue, speaking to this particular thing. I've taken, not that I'm trying to toot my horn, but took a white ally class on how I, as a white person, can be an ally to people of color and be able to speak to other folks that may look more like I do about the fact that this does exist. A year ago, almost to the day, it was the first Sunday in February, a friend of mine asked me to preach at her church. Black History Month is February, and she asked me to preach on racism. And so I did a sermon on white privilege in a congregation that looked like I look. Yeah, talk about a lead balloon. It just went boom. After the service, nobody said, "I really enjoyed your message, Pastor," or "Glad you were here, Pastor." I got a hello, hello, hello. I was like, wow. But my friend wanted me to do that because I get to leave and she can come in and continue the conversation with folks without being the bad guy. Okay, so it sounds like I got this, right? Like I'm good. I understand white privilege. I rail against it. Well, 2 weeks ago, this summer, I'm United Methodist, and most people understand what's going on in the United Methodist Church and the battle within it over human sexuality. And so I am on the side of progressiveness and full inclusion of folks irrespective of their sexuality. And at our annual conference, the folks that think like I do and have that theology were systematically silenced by the folks that are very conservative. I'm not used to being silenced. In case you couldn't tell, I like to talk. And so I was been really struggling with this since June. I don't even know if I want to stay United Methodist. I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to see the people that did that, because you don't silence people. That's just wrong. Everybody has a right to have their voice heard, whether you agree with them or not. And so struggle with this whole thing. And I talked to my district superintendent, who is a Black woman, and I'm telling her this story. And as I'm standing there telling this story, looking at her, I'm thinking, really, Kellie, really? You've been silenced, maybe twice in your life? You have been dismissed and disregarded maybe twice in your life? And Dawn, who is my superintendent, is a wonderfully gracious, kind, wise woman. And she very kindly, talked to me and encouraged me not to let other people dictate what I do, what I don't do. Don't let them in my head rent free, all those things I tell everybody else. But as I left that conversation, I kept thinking to myself, really, you're going to stand there and whine and moan and complain to a Black woman about being silenced once, twice in your life? Really? A little bit of white privilege going on there, don't you think, Kellie? Because Dawn is used to being silenced often, especially in Pittsburgh. And so was convicted about that, and I sent her a text message apologizing to her for my insensitivity and not being aware of, my white privilege, and, stop whining and do something about it. So that's just to kind of say that my struggle is not over. and the journey continues. And as I say, amen.